The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss on Balthasar's book, Holding Both Up. There we hope the woman be saved. We are on the chapter concerning Origen and Augustine. And where are we in the book? The first chapter had to do with what the controversy is, not whether hell is empty or whether we can name people in there, but to what extent may we hope for the salvation of all. And he laid that out in the second chapter, which was the New Testament. He goes through the two series of texts that have to do with salvation. The texts that speak very graphically about the Last Judgment, going to the left or to the right, and the texts which encourage us to pray for the salvation of all. And Balthasar's point is that we're under judgment, we, each individual, and it's not up to us to decide who is on the left and who is on the right. Then this chapter we're about to finish now on Origen and Augustine. Of course, Balthasar was a great student of the fathers of the church, knew them well, and he has done major works, both works and compilations of Origen, called Geist and Feuer, Spirit and Fire, and of Augustine. So he knows these writers very well. And of course, Augustine is known for being alleged as a universalist, apokatastasis, that is the universal restoration of all things. And Augustine is known for the massa damnata, there's a certain number of people we know with certainty are in hell. And so he is discussing where they got their ideas from, what their ideas really were, and that's where we are. So, Joseph, you wanted to make a comment on something in this chapter.
Yeah, so what I'm finding sort of fascinating and I'm learning a lot from is where the various saints, including doctors of the church, stood on this thorny topic, should we say. And I was particularly intrigued to find that St. Clement of Alexandria believed that all punishments in the afterworld are, quote, corrective. In other words, that obviously if you're damned, it's no point correcting anything any longer. You're just damned. So this is footnote 33 on page 45.
Okay, I see. All right.
So the idea that after we die, punishment is just, and of course, in that case, merciful if we're not going to hell. So just and merciful, but corrective. In other words, they're purgatorial. And obviously, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, a few words being plucked out from a work by a saint without us being able to look at the buttress it with the context. But nonetheless, if saints of the caliber of St. Clement of Alexandria and St. Gregory of Nyssa are believing that the afterworld, the punishment is corrective, in other words, purgatorial, then clearly there are very good saints that have a great deal of gravitas in terms of being taken seriously by the church, that seem to be saying that that after death our punishment is to correct us, to purge us of sin, not merely to damn us, which I find very interesting.
It certainly shows that von Balthasar is no outlier simply for raising the question, that this was something that's been discussed in the church through generations of great minds, great souls, great saints, having differing understandings. And of course, the magisterial teaching of the church is what's authoritative, right? But certainly these people who cast all kinds of aspersions on von Balthasar for even broaching the subject or asking the questions, seeing something like this, Joseph.
That's really what I'm saying, is no one can or should call these great saints and doctors of the church heretics.
Right.
So that's the point. In other words, this does appear to be an issue that we are able, as long as we don't fall into the dogmatic trap of becoming universalists, of stating explicitly and dogmatically that everybody is saved, because we're not allowed to say that. That's a heresy. If we don't say that, right, then I don't see that that there's a problem with discussing the nature of God's judgment and what that means for us with respect to the afterlife.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, you go, Father.
Well, there is this argument can be made. Well, yes, maybe Clement and Gregor Nyssa had these views, but the church refines those over time, and we're no longer able to have those views because the church has spoken. But the point is, the church hasn't spoken in the sense of confirming certainty about individuals in hell.
And that certainty is the whole crux of the biscuit for von Balthasar, because on page 47, which is, Father, just a couple pages after where we are, where he's taking issue with Augustine. And by the way, von Balthasar is a huge admirer of Augustine and has plumbed his works and written about his works. And so it isn't as though he's throwing Augustine into the dustbin by any means, but what he's concerned about is how Augustine becomes a knower rather than, and so he, on page 47, the enormous stress that we find Augustine now placing on the reality not only of hell, but also of its numerous inhabitants is no longer surprising. Nevertheless, it signifies a turning point in church history insofar as Augustine interprets the relevant text in such a way as to show that he plainly and simply knows about the outcome of divine judgment. And all those bowing to his authority, from Gregory the Great through the early High Middle Ages, and he lists them, Anselm, Bonaventure, Thomas, not accepted, to the Reformers and Jansenists, you might throw in the Calvinists, will become knowers in the same sense, taking this knowledge as a fully secure basis upon which to construct their further speculations about God's twofold predetermination, post or ante
Previsa merita, that is, after or before the foreseen marriage. So that was a complicated theological discussion where how do you have free will? Well, God foresees what you're going to do, you know.
And then he goes on with Augustine. But you were about to say something.
Well, yeah, I just want to go just so we don't get ahead of my next. Well, I'll highlight next because it's not a caveat, but shall we say, as balancing things here, I'm not necessarily comfortable with some of von Balthasar's line of reasoning. So, for instance, on footnote 38 here on page 46, towards the bottom of that, the fact that God's love of his enemies is strongly emphasized. Now, the fact that God loves his enemies doesn't necessarily mean that no one's going to hell. To me, there's a non sequitur. We've discussed, and von Balthasar discusses that hell is basically turning your back on God. You've got your back turned on God of your own volition. That doesn't mean God doesn't love you, but you still have your back turned to him. So I don't think the fact that God loves his enemies means that he wouldn't let his enemies go to hell. If they insist upon it, and he respects the freedom that he's given them, then he will permit that, right? So the fact that doesn't mean he doesn't love them. The fact that he's allowing them of their own volition to choose where they want to spend eternity.
All right. Well, I think this footnote is about things that Maximus the Confessor wrote. Is that right? And I must say, I didn't follow this carefully, this note, or what it's all about. But certainly we do know that von Balthasar agrees with you, Joseph, that people can choose to go apart from God, and they do. But he's certainly not arguing with that.
Not, as we discussed previously, it's whether or not God remains the hound of heaven and doesn't just leave them with their backs turned, but continues to
right. And we're just not given the sight to see into this outcome and where it's going to, we just have to be humble and hopeful and hope for others as we hope for ourselves, which is just like loving others as we love ourselves. Hope is a form of love, really. Anyway, but then when he goes on to show some of the other things that Augustine says, I mean, you can see that it really puts Balthasar back on his heels. I mean, on page 49, at the top there, he says, now comes a distinction that really takes one's breath away. Yeah, okay, and he gives this quote, I think this is from Augustine.
City of God. It's all
Yeah.
City of God.
Okay, and where, but if the church, this is Augustine now, if the church were certified who those are, who though they are still abiding in this life, meaning who those are going to hell, are yet predestined to go with the devil into eternal fire, then for them, she, the church, could no more pray than for him, meaning the devil. But since she has this certainty regarding no man, she prays for all her enemies who yet live in the world, and yet she is not heard in behalf of all. And you can, I can understand why von Balthasar just went, wait, what?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a big problem with it. If I understand what Augustine's saying here, he's basically saying that obviously God knows who's going to hell. He doesn't send them there, but he knows.
Well, wait a second. Okay, well, go ahead.
Yeah. So that
God does not know who is going to hell. That's for sure. God does not know who is going to hell, because God does not know anything in the future. He is the future.
Right. Exactly. Well, God knows. God knows who is in hell. If you want to change the tense, right? So the point is, if we're praying for people because we don't have that knowledge, and God does have that knowledge, then clearly our prayers for that person are not going to be.
No, because God does not have that knowledge. If it hasn't happened yet.
So you're saying that God did not know until last week that we were going to have this conversation now?
That's exactly right, because there's no last week or next week for God.
Right, but he knows. Not will know, but he knows. That's what his omniscience is. So
he knows from our point of view after it's happened, yeah.
Okay, God knows who's in hell.
When they're there, if they're there.
God knows who's in hell. Yeah, even if no one's there, God knows who's in hell, right? And clearly that.
But not till they're there. Not till they're there.
We don't.
So he doesn't know any more than we do whether they're there or not until they're there.
See, Augustine is assuming that God knows, has predestined some people for hell, and therefore he's not going to hear our prayers on their behalf because this is already a sealed deal, you know?
Well, no, I don't think he's using predestination in any Calvinistic sense. I think it's omniscience, that he knows that these people are going to refuse of their own free will to the graces that are offered them throughout their lives, and he knows that, and therefore, of course, we don't know that, so of course we should pray for them, and of course we do, and we should. But insofar as someone is going to hell, our prayers aren't going to have any effect.
Well, see, every time you say aren't going to have or will do this, that's just, don't put that into God. You're projecting your temporal view of things into God. Well, we're in this together. God and we are in this together.
You're the one that says
we can't say now
God doesn't know what's going to happen. You're the one saying God doesn't know what's going to happen. I'm trying to avoid that terminology.
I didn't get that one.
He says, you're the one saying God doesn't know what's going to happen. And he's trying to avoid that terminology.
Okay, but therefore, you can't say God won't hear our prayers now because he knows they're going to be in hell. You can't say that.
Well, he hears our prayers. He hears our prayers,
but it's a false statement.
He hears our prayers, and those prayers might be efficacious to us as regards gaining us grace. But insofar as they're going to be answered for the individual person who's in hell, is another matter.
You can pray for your dead grandfather who you knew died in the course of a sin, because your prayer was heard by God at the moment of creation, which is the same moment as the moment of judgment, by the way. But the point is, God hears all our prayers.
Of course.
Well, here he says she's not heard. The church is not heard. I mean, I can see why Balthasar, I mean, I was shocked by it too. The church is not heard. Some prayers are heard, some prayers are not heard. What position does that put those of us who pray in? You're wondering, well, gee, is he listening to this one? Is this one okay? Can I pray for this person? Am I just wasting my time? I mean, I can see why taking this view leads to taking one's breath away. Anyway, but
I want to go back to you skipped over one I want to mention, which I think is one of Augustin's better arguments. It must have been around your page 48, something like that, because in this paragraph beginning in the city of God.
Oh, yeah. That's on page 47 for us, the last paragraph.
Yeah, but it's a big paragraph. But 10 lines down, he says, the main argument against those compassionate ones, that is, those who think that maybe, hell is not eternal for men, is that if they're going to have compassion for their fellow men, then they ought not to place limits on that compassion, but should extend it all the way to evil angels. And I think that is a logical thing. Hey, wait a minute. If you're going to say that maybe maybe we have to hope for all men, and therefore maybe we can't be certain anybody's in hell. What about, because of the compassion, what about the angels? Are you going to pray for them too?
Well, I think there's a qualitative difference between the fall of the angels and the fall of men. That when men fall, they're deceived. All temptation, in the heart of all temptation is a lie. And when we succumb to temptation, we're deceived. And hopefully, as we suffer the misery of sin, our eyes are opened, we're undeceived, and we repent now that we see the truth for what it is, But for the angels, there's no deception. There's no veil between their eyes and God. They behold God. They know who God is. God's still beyond them, so in a certain sense, they don't know him completely. But I think the idea behind the irrevocability of their choice in the church's teaching, I think this is church teaching, that there's kind of an irrevocable choice that they made because they did this in the full light of day, in the full knowledge. There was no deception, no clouding of their judgment. No, they chose to place themselves above God, even knowing who God is. That's a different kind of choice from what fools we mortals be, as Puck says in Midsummer Night's Dream. What fools we mortals be, The angels aren't in that camp. And so that's why I think there is a qualitative difference. Now, maybe I'm mistaken, but...
Well, I think two things are true. What you just said, that there's no time in our sense for angels, so there's no time to repent. Your choice is your life. However, it's also the case that we know from Revelation that the angels have fallen and they are in hell. So this is something we do have certain knowledge about. But we do not have certain knowledge about any human beings who have definitively rejected God and therefore are in hell.
Right, and that's why we don't pray for the fallen angels.
Right.
But this question was, why don't we even extend compassion to the fallen angels? And I think the reason why we don't extend compassion to them is because we know that, they weren't just stumbling around in the dark, and then the light comes on and they can see what they've done. No, the light was on the whole time. And they chose what they did.
I think that even words like compassion, when you're talking about angels, I mean, that's sort of anthropomorphic. We're sort of projecting upon the angelic something which is human. And I think there's an abyss that separates us from them in that sense. And it's not useful to try to humanize them.
Yes, good. That's a very good point.
Also on page 48, if we can, I'm just pointing out things here which I didn't know, and therefore perhaps the viewers and readers of the book also might not know, and I find very enlightening. I'm not a philosopher. The middle of the page there, page 48, same paragraph, Father, from issue we're just reading, just another 10 or so lines further down. The Platonists, indeed, while they maintain that no sins are unpunished, suppose that all punishment is administered for remedial purposes, being inflicted by human or divine law in this life or after death. This again is Augustine quoting a quote from Augustine from the City of God. So, I did not know that the Platonists believe that no sins are unpunished, but that all punishment is for remedial purposes, and if it's not inflicted in this life, it's inflicted in the next life, and it might be inflicted by human law or divine law. All of that I found very, very fascinating because I didn't know.
I circled it too, Joseph. I didn't know that either. And of course, there was a lot of Neoplatonism in the early church among a lot of these great minds and souls who were writing at that time on church matters and doctrine, these sorts of things. So that is interesting.
I want to quote this thing. It's just below footnote 53 is the end of the paragraph there.
Page 50 on ours.
50, okay. And he says, the door was firmly closed and carefully fitted with many bolts, and for the theology of posterity, it has long remained locked. So Augustine is the origin of this particular view. And it's been very powerful because of Augustine's tremendous brilliance and holiness. And
yet he, von Balthasar, I love the fact that he yet ends this chapter on explaining why Augustine ended up where he did. He said that this is the bottom of our page 52 and the top of our page 53. So basically the last paragraph of the chapter, Father.
Okay.
And he says, von Balthasar saying his campaign, Augustine's campaign, was directed not only against laxity, but also, and quite rightly so, against the presumptuous hope of the great church fathers mentioned above, that Christians, even when they were grievous sinners, would not have to have any fear of final condemnation. And this is von Balthasar talking now. This had to be corrected. This had to be corrected. You cannot, for man's own good, you cannot take away from him the understanding that he is under judgment, that he is capable of choosing to say yes to God and choosing to say no to God, even in the course of a single hour. And I was telling Father, I'm more and more seeing my life under judgment as, the swinging door between the kitchen and the dining room, And when God's asking me to do something and I go, no, I go through the swinging door out into the outer darkness. And then I feel the misery out there and I quickly go rushing back into the warmth of the kitchen. Yes, I will. Give me the strength.
I was going to wonder which room, your living room or your kitchen was the outer darkness. Now I know. Okay.
Yeah, good. Well, the kitchen, the kitchen's sort of the hearth of my home, and it's warm and cozy in there. I'm always cooking in there, and we all know food is love. So in any case, these refusals, these daily refusals to not love, to not be patient, even if it's just in my thoughts, to withhold love, to withhold patience and these sorts of things, to withhold gentleness, to exercise meekness. Whenever I say no, I'm going out the door. I really am. And fortunately, God is so kind to me that I immediately feel cold and alone out there. Don't like it one bit. And I go back in. Okay. Give me the strength that I need to shut my mouth, if that's what needs to be done here, or whatever it might be. Stop quarreling or stop tearing that person down and criticize, whatever it is. But I'm just saying that in the course of a single day, Joseph, I'm going back and forth through this swinging door. And so if I didn't have the fear and trembling that I could end up on the wrong side of the door at an importune time in my life, if I didn't live with that fear in the proper sense of the word of losing God's friendship, then what progress would I be making in the spiritual life? None, you see. So von Balthasar is agreeing with Augustine that without this proper fear of losing God's friendship, we would become lax. And this needed to be corrected. So I just wanted that this is the word he ended this chapter on, that Augustine was right to correct this overconfidence, shall we say, this presumption, shall we say, that we could never possibly lose friendship with God, when that is a real possibility.
Well, in the chapter on personal character, emphasize that we'll get to that, especially Kierkegaard's statement, which is really a phenomenal statement. But while we're still in this chapter, a couple of things before we conclude it. In that same paragraph you just quoted, which is the last paragraph in the chapter, at the beginning, 3 lines down or so, he says, talking about the 2 great geniuses of patristic theology, Origen and Augustine.
That's our page 51 in the middle.
In what was said above, there was by no means any intention to place the, in themselves largely opposed, teachings on hell of Origen and Augustine in the center of their theological thinking.
Right.
That's important for 2 reasons. One, it is true of Origen and Augustine. And 2, it's true of von Balthasar. We're not trying to put this book in the center of his teaching. All right.
Very good.
But it's important. Like when I review manuscripts, we have 500 a year come in. If I flip through it. If I see something about which I know something and the author disagrees and I think is wrong, then I just say we're not doing that one because I don't trust this author. So I can see how someone can take this book and say, oh, well, that's von Balthasar. I don't trust him. But just like with Augustine and Origen, you can't treat these great men that way.
I would feel even more comfortable, Father, actually, if we looked upon this, both in terms of Augustine's discussion of it, Origen's, and this book, as taken as a whole, by von Balthasar, as a footnote on their legacy. In other words, that we should not be judging any of these men on the basis of what they said on this particular discussion, because it's not a core, it's not central to, first of all, what they were teaching. And as ultimately, I think this is all a question of speculation, because we don't know. It's also not central.
Well, also in that same, just the previous paragraph there, which is on page 50 for you, there's a quote. And here's the quote. The truth is not simply an either or, either somebody is in hell or nobody is. Both are partial expressions of the whole truth. Thus, too, Ignatius has a right to make his meditations on hell and instruct that they be made. The truth consists in a sum total of partial truths, and each of these partial truths must be wholly expressed, wholly thought out, and lived through. We do not arrive at the truth, and we only bring out one part and cover up the other. In every perspective, the whole must come to expression. Now, this is important. Who's that quote from? Adrian von Speyer.
Yep, it's page 51, by the way. The big
thank
excerpt.
you, because I was finding it difficult. Is that indented quote? Okay, thank you.
And because, of course, he was her spiritual director. She was, he believes, and I think he's right, a genuine mystic. Multiple volumes that he dictated to her.
And she dictated to him.
I mean, she did to him. Some will say he did to her, but I mean, yes. And then finally, on that footnote 55 there, nevertheless, in conclusion, 2 French masters of theology must be cited. The first one here he does is Rondet, I think. But he says, quote, Augustine solidified in historical opposites something that was for St. Paul a dialectical opposition. Footnote 55?
Oh, footnote 55.
Yeah. I'll read it again. Augustine solidified in historical opposites something that was for Paul a dialectical opposition. And that's the whole thing Balthasar is pointing out here. Anything else on that chapter?
That's a really, gosh, I'm so glad you drew our attention to that quote. And who's that quote from?
Henri Rondet, a wonderful French theologian.
Because there's a big difference between solid opposites that can't interpenetrate each other and can't talk to each other and can't make each other fruitful by the working out together versus a dialectical opposition where you have things that seemingly seem like opposites or different sides or whatever, but that it's actually through the correspondence back and forth between them that some bigger whole can come forward, which is different from paradox, you're right, which is, well, we have an apparent contradiction, but it's not really a contradiction. It's really, but maybe there's a relationship.
I think there is
between paradox and dialectical opposition.
I think there is. I think there are two ways of expressing a very similar, at least, reality.
Reality's always bigger than we are.
A lot bigger.
It better be.
So, all right. Anything else on this chapter, Origen and Augustine?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a perfect time to conclude this session and wish you all well and hope to see you on the next session. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.